Our food systems have become incredibly productive. However, what makes it incredibly productive also makes it incredibly fragile and also makes it incredibly impactful with respect to our environment and climate system. You're looking at a fifth to a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture is the leading driver of non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, and so these are things like methane and nitrous oxide.
Sonali McDermid, thank you so much for joining us on The Breakdown.
Thank you for having me.
This is a huge topic, so I want to dive right in, but just before we do, it'd be great if you could just start off by telling us all a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Sonali McDermid. I'm an associate professor and chair of the Environmental Studies Department here at New York University. I'm a climate scientist by training. I got my background working with climate models and trying to understand warm climate conditions and how that impacts atmospheric circulation. But over the last 10 to 12 years, I've been working at the intersection of climate change, agriculture, food systems, and land use. So I've become really interested in how climate change will impact agriculture, food production, and food security, importantly. And then the other half of my work really explores how the way that we manage and interact with the land surface feeds back to impact the climate system, right? The way that we farm, the way that we manage the land, the way that we manipulate the land and water can change all sorts of characteristics about the land surface that impact the way climate change manifests and the way that we feel it. So I'm interested in both those questions.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to dive into all of that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Summarize the conversation for us, which is great.
For sure.
But it would be great if we could just start with, this is a big question, but sort of a big picture of, what exactly are we looking at when it comes to how the climate crisis will affect food systems, and maybe on a kind of tangible level that like you or I would experience. What will this look like over the next several years, and how exactly do those interactions kind of work?
Yeah, for sure. And so to me, there's two really important questions there. One is the sort of physical, biophysical contribution, right? That's how will climate change impact our ability to grow and produce food. And then there's this other question about how will climate change impact what we eat, how often we eat, these ideas that kind of come together in this idea of food security. And these two things are not always the same thing, and that's important to remember. So taking the first part of this, right, how will climate change impact food production and what we grow, and that we already know and we're already experiencing challenges, right? So climate change on the whole, we expect, on a global scale, to negatively impact food security, unfortunately. And that's through long-term changes that can, in addition to land use change, that can depress yields or make farming in certain places much more difficult. And increasingly, I think the things that are on our minds much more are these short-term shocks and impacts related to climate extremes. So sporadic droughts, floods even, heat extremes, these can all, extreme storms, hail, for example, these can all impact and are impacting agricultural production as we know it. And this runs the gamut between the staple crops that we tend to rely on. So these are our commodity grains, right? Maize, rice, wheat, soy, for different end uses. But also the things that, may not necessarily serve food security by way of consumption, but things that we value, the coffee and tea in your cup, for example, chocolate, right? These other sorts of commodities that people do very much care about. And all of these different crops are sensitive in different ways to different environmental conditions. And unfortunately, climate change stands to impact everything from heat, from moisture to soil moisture to rainfall to, to looking at what we call vapor pressure deficits, how drying the atmosphere is. Through these myriad variables, climate change is expected to continue negatively impacting agricultural production. Now, there is an interesting response that some agricultural crops have to climate change, that some people say, well, this could maybe be a good thing, and that's by way of, with higher carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you'll probably remember from your high school education that plants like carbon dioxide. And so, yeah, we actually do see a bit of CO2 fertilization effect in some crops. These tend to be crops that are grown in mid-latitude conditions, for example, not so much the southern hotter latitudes, right, or equatorial latitudes. And so we're seeing a little bit of that, but that comes with trade-offs we can talk about later. The other thing that people note is that, okay, well, what about Canada or the UK, right, or places that are historically quite cold? Won't it get warmer and allow for longer growing seasons? And sure, that seems to be happening and could happen to an extent, but when you start to look at, well, how does that add up across the globe, the picture is not a good one on balance. And so those are the kinds of broad considerations we have, and we can break down the different types of climate changes we're expecting with respect to temperature and water, for example, and talk about that individually. So on the production side of things, yes, there might be small gains in very targeted places, but on the whole, the picture doesn't look that good. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean in and of itself that we can't feed the world. There are a variety of ways that we can still make production resilient to climatic change and still feed the world. And we can talk about adaptive ways to do that a little bit later. And so I think it's just important to note that production alone, even though that picture doesn't look very rosy, does not have to mean people go hungry. So then the question becomes, well, what does climate change do to make people go hungry? And so there it becomes a lot more complicated. Climate change, we talk about food availability and production, but there's also food access and food utilization. So do you have the physical and economic ability to access food when you need it? And then when you have the food, can you derive the full complement of nutrients from it, right? Can you cook it well? Can you consume it on time? Can you make sure that it's nutritious and it's clean, right? It's not contaminated in any way. So climate change can impact those elements by things like extreme events taking out, for example, flooding or even sea level rise, or thinking about extreme storms and events that make transportation and shipping and redistribution of food much more difficult. We can think about things like supply chains and, can the food leave the farm gate and travel under, for example, refrigerated conditions, or when it's not too hot, and actually make it, with its full nutritional profile to the point of consumption, right? Climate change can also indirectly impact food security and drive hunger issues with driving other changes to water supplies, right? And that can be both water availability, but also water quality, for example. That's not going to be helpful if you face water quality issues and need to be using that water to consume your food. So there are all these other ways in which climate change can impact what we eat, and we're seeing that present itself. We're seeing these issues present themselves again, mostly in the context of extremes. Mostly in the context of extremes. So that's a bit of an overview, and within each one of those distinct areas of impact that I've mentioned, you could go very deep. Another thing that comes to mind are pests and diseases, right? And it's the pest and disease that's impacting the crop, but ultimately you have an important climate change driver in there that makes the prevalence of pests and diseases in certain areas much higher. So you could dive deep into every single one of these different impact areas, but the aggregate of that, it presents some challenges for us looking at the intersection of climate change and food security, for sure.
Amazing sort of crash course.
And
sure. I want to come back to probably several of the points you've just outlined there, but before we do that, I'd love to just touch on the kind of other side of the coin, right, which is how is climate change impacting food systems, but the other question being, how are our food systems and the way that we sort of do agriculture right now, what is the role of that in sort of driving the climate crisis, and what is the significance of food systems and, in that, and how much do they need to change, and what kind of changes are we looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, it's sort of the wicked problem here. Our food systems have become incredibly productive beyond what we could have even imagined, definitely moving beyond some of the considerations we had in the 19th century and even before that about population crashes as a result, right? So we've been able to buck those trends, thankfully. However, what makes it incredibly productive also makes it incredibly fragile and also makes it incredibly impactful with respect to our environment and climate system. And so together, food systems, so we're looking at production, we're looking at the land use, land cover change that must occur for that level of production. We're looking at transportation across the entirety of the food system. You're looking at 1/5 to 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture is the leading driver of non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, and so these are things like methane and nitrous oxide that are incredibly potent, more potent than carbon dioxide, and are rising unabated in ways that we can actually tackle carbon dioxide in a bit more of a straightforward way. And agriculture is a very difficult, it's not a point source like a coal-fired power plant, for example, so it can be much more difficult to mitigate. In addition to that, right, so it's a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change and warming levels as a result of that and all the different weather events and extremes that impacts. The other important thing to note is that when we look beyond climate change, because we're facing multiple problems, it's not just climate change. We're looking at biodiversity loss, we're looking at nutrient pollution, we're looking at ocean acidification, right, which is, runs in parallel to climate change, but is a slightly distinctive problem. Again, agriculture becomes some of the leading drivers of biodiversity loss, both genetic and in terms of the number of species. In terms of habitat area, it is the biggest driver of nutrient pollution, mostly in the form of nitrogen, but another key agricultural fertilizers as well too. And so that drives changes in ecosystems and in the environmental conditions of different environments like coastal systems, right? We talk about big dead zones, for example, in coastal areas where aquatic life is struggling, and that's really a direct result of nutrient pollution, much of that from agriculture. So agriculture's water, for example, and we talk about water scarcity, and we think about that with respect to climate change and how climate change and warming drives water scarcity. But agriculture is the biggest user of freshwater, of our precious freshwater stores, right? About 70% globally of our freshwater withdrawals go towards agricultural irrigation. So again, the elephant in the room. So across all of these other dimensions, agriculture is a leading player, and that's very much related to 20th century gains in productivity. So now we're confronted with the situation that we've tuned our production systems to these highly productive, highly sensitive systems. And at the same time, and they've done really well for us in terms of bringing down food prices, but at the same time, they're incurring environmental damages that are costing us in other places. And so yes, ultimately, we need to find ways to ensure that people have enough to eat while also resolving not just the climate change issue, but that in conjunction with a range of other issues that agriculture drives. Yeah.
Yeah, and phenomenally productive, and yet, some 800 million people go hungry every year. Is that,
yes.
I think,
yeah.
bad at figures.
Yeah, and that number had been going down for a little while, and then the COVID crisis sort of complicated those figures in addition to some recent extremes. So that 800 million number that you're seeing right now is actually rising when it was actually declining. So you could have actually looked at this pre-COVID and said, well, it's a lot of people, and that we need to resolve. But the trend line is going down, and unfortunately, it seems to have been reversed. So we're not as productive as these food systems are. They're causing environmental damage, and we are not feeding the world. So this is something we really need to confront.
And how much of that relates to, I guess, the way that we organize agriculture right now? So you kind of touched on it there a little bit, but it'd be amazing if you could sort of break down what the actual kind of structure of global food production looks like. I mean, I know that, a sort of handful of companies kind of have most of the world's seeds, for example. Sure. But could you talk about, sort of how we distribute and sort of stratify agriculture in that way?
Absolutely. And so, there's many different ways to think about the players and actors and the structure of those players and actors in the agricultural food system. So we tend to, on the physical, agronomic, agricultural production side of things, stratify large landholders and large production systems. And so these are systems that tend to be quite homogeneous, tend to be quite monoculturally driven, right? We've got maybe a handful of crops. They tend to be export oriented, or if they are domestically focused, they're still pretty intensive on just a handful of crops that have been improved over the 20th century into the modern period. And those systems have benefited in terms of just pure productivity in the gains, the technological gains that we've made over the 20th century in a combination of seed and ability to tap water, for example, like groundwater stores, and in terms of synthetic nitrogen and synthetic fertilizers, and a host of other inputs. And so those technology packages together have made agriculture, with respect to just looking at yields, quite efficient, and quite capable of being adapted into systems where you actually don't need as many people. You're really, you can do a lot on a lot of land with a high deal of mechanization. And as I mentioned, those are the crops, maize, rice, wheat, and soy come to mind. There's a handful of others. These systems tend to dominate and or largely influence the prices of these commodity crops. They tend to be really important levers across the world for a host of different systems. On the other end of that spectrum, and there's a lot in between this, so this is sort of a very reduced way of talking about it. There's a lot of complexity in there. But on the other end of the system, canonically, are our smallholder agricultural systems. They tend to be much more diversified. In South Asia, where we work a lot, you're talking about less than an acre of land that most of these farmers are sitting on. And they tend to be less export-driven and more serving local populations, local food security, maybe their subsistence, and so a big portion of what they're producing is going to feed their own households, for example, or local markets. And so that's the other end of the spectrum. And in those cases, the yields tend to be quite a bit lower, although, you could make the argument that maybe if they are quite diversified, that whole system productivity can still be quite high. But crop for crop, the yields tend to be a bit lower. They tend to be, in some ways, susceptible to pests and diseases that the bigger folks may not be, although both systems are highly sensitive to various things. And even though there's redundancy built in through a few different crops that they might be growing together, there just doesn't tend to be the economies of scale where smallholders can weather the kinds of shocks that a large landholder can, particularly if the large landholder is getting, instruments like crop insurance or something else to help them pass through different stressors. So that's sort of the other end of the spectrum. And in theory, these different farming systems serve different parts of the food system. Some serve direct food security, where some are going into a globally integrated agricultural system. But in practice, the way that the bigger systems tend to influence prices, so that if you're a smallholder growing maize in a system where you're actually oriented towards more local consumption and local production, you could still be impacted by some of these broader price anomalies. And so what happens on some of the bigger land holdings in more industrialized countries and industrialized systems can reverberate through the food system and what we're seeing today. And that's really a function of the globalization of the food system and the way that we tend to we double down in specializing in different crops around the world and then trade those the world over, right? That has its advantages from a global perspective. But, one of the things you hear a lot about, and you hear economists sort of say this quite a bit too, the boom in 20th century technology and technological packages and the productivity in agriculture has been, on the whole, fairly good for consumers and prices of food and your ability to economically access food. It has had very mixed results for farmers and producers, and that distributes across that size of land holding and the industrial level of industrialization across farms. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop there on that particular answer, but we tend to look at the picture in that way, and that does open to very different solutions and different ways of thinking, and in some case talking past each other when we talk about what the solution space is in agriculture, because we're looking at it through those lenses largely.
Well, I'd love to turn to solutions a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that, in sort of general public conversation, when we talk about the relationship between food and climate, the answer is often quite simplistic, which is, we all just kind of need to stop eating meat and dairy. Is it really that simple, or is what we need to do more complicated than that?
So we sort of have to look at the solution space as a multi-solution space, right, and not just necessarily one solution, and because the system is complex. Right now, what we know is that meat and dairy are within the agricultural system overwhelmingly the largest contributors to the environmental footprint of agricultural production. We also know that when you look at really any dietary standard, we consume too much in wealthy industrialized nations. And so there's no question that ramping down consumption within those contexts is necessary to meet some of our most ambitious climate targets, okay? So, and so this is where the complexity now comes in, right? And that is, as I mentioned, you can really identify that need for action in industrialized Western countries. Now, when you start to move towards industrializing countries, countries that are coming out in particular of, kind of emerging from their post-colonial, their post-colonial legacies, there the picture becomes more complicated in the sense that, there's, from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, right, they're not the biggest contributors to some of this problem. You could argue from a land use land cover change they might be, but there are cultural sensitivities as well to consider as well too. But the focus on nutrition, the focus on trying to ensure that you have the full complement of resources in nutrition to hit, I suppose, and this is where this is more of what I'm hesitating on. I don't like the idea that there's some, uniform development standard that needs to be applied to every single country or every single context. But to the extent that you want these countries to be alleviated from the economic burdens that they've experienced, there needs to be an assortment of things to change. But there might be an emphasis on what's needed for that development, to the extent that they have agency over that. And that might be reflected in a slightly different diet than the kinds of things that we would be expecting wealthy Western nations largely to be doing, right? So you might, for example, have an arc of meat consumption that then comes down over time, reflecting what would be a more canonical development trajectory in those cases. I think from my perspective, it's important to identify the locus of where do you have the biggest impacts and where do you have the biggest environmental drivers of those impacts, and what is the most effective way to target both at the same time. And so my focus has really been on looking at reducing that consumption level in industrialized Western countries where, remember, it's not just about what you're consuming here, but what you're consuming within a context as in a wealthy industrialized country also has an impact someplace else that's being deforested, right? So there are these sort of remote impacts across that. So I think if you reframe the question slightly and to say, is it just that easy, rather to say something like, where is the biggest bang for your buck right now, right? Where do you actually get the most positive climate and environmental gain while targeting a population that for which meat and dairy consumption isn't necessarily food security, right? That's a luxury consumption. then doing that in industrialized Western nations is the biggest bang for your buck at that moment, right? And I think that's how I'm looking at the problem. When you start looking at other contexts, yes, of course it becomes more complicated, right? It becomes more complicated because you have to not just look, food doesn't occur in isolation, it occurs alongside women's empowerment, it occurs alongside education, it occurs alongside economic opportunities. So to say that you're going to target one thing without looking at everything else is not actually going to serve the purpose. It's not going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. It might even incur a few more problems down the road. I don't think it necessarily has to. I think there are ways to foster a more plant-based approach and eating lower on the food chain approach that can actually hit all of those goals across those contexts. But I don't think we're in the same position. We don't have that same leverage in those areas. And so we need to be sensitive to what the demands are and what the needs are within these areas so that we bring all of those metrics together. We sort of raise all of those metrics together. So I guess the answer to your question is that it is a lot more complicated, but at the same time, it's not. There are these really big leverage points that we could be targeting, and I would never want how complicated the situation is to be a crutch or to be an excuse for not acting where we can now. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I want to pick up on the idea of, if we know that, the kind of intensive industrial agriculture and kind of farming that we do, particularly, in North America in this context, but sort of all over, is a big problem on the ecological front, kind of nitrogen runoff. It's also a huge problem on a kind of human front.
Right.
Most of the lowest paid jobs in the United States are in agriculture,
Absolutely.
often highly exploitative conditions.
Absolutely.
If that needs to go in a way, what are the alternatives we're looking at? There's a kind of movement around this idea of agroecology, which maybe it'd be great if you could unpack. And is that something that you think is actually viable as a solution at a kind of global scale?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it's a question I struggle with a lot because, this question tends to polarize. You either start to, find yourself moving to this limit of highly industrialized systems just without the animals, right? And just but really taking advantage of all the technological opportunity, consolidating land, consolidating farms, and being super productive. Or you wind up moving to the other end of the spectrum where you say everything is disaggregated, a bunch of very small land holdings, mostly in cooperative or collaborative formats, highly diversified, and really serving more regional, local scale. I don't know that either one of those things is going to get us what we want in the end. And I think the beauty of agriculture and the beauty of human engagement with land systems is that those should reflect the heterogeneity and the variation and just how different land is depending upon where you go. And there needs to be combination somehow of bottom-up ensuring that the local people and the local ecosystems are represented and have agency over the way food is produced in a particular area, but also knowing that what you do locally has an impact globally. We are never moving away from a global system, right? We have families and friends and relationships and all over the world at this point. So to move away and to say, oh, we're going to effectively, start to operate purely on these local scales, that's not a reality that I see us going back towards, nor is it something that I think we should aspire to, in my personal opinion. So if we know that either of these poles are not going to serve our goals, then it opens up this really complex set of questions of what do we value and how do we balance these systems in between. I think the future of agriculture, in my opinion, is going to be a combination of these things. I see a lot of utility in modern production systems when delivered responsibly to a certain extent to help create high productivity with high efficiency, and even more so if those calories are nutritious and going directly to people. I think there is an important role for that to play in anchoring in agricultural production and anchoring a global system, and maybe not even anchoring, but providing that kind of option for a globalized system. At the same time, there are going to be places, many places on the planet, where those systems just are not viable or should not be viable for a variety of reasons. And that could be physical reasons, the way the landscape actually is. That could be economic reasons. It could be reasons tied to cultural wherewithal. And in those landscapes, you could imagine a diversified system really, really doing really well and serving the needs of those communities. And I think that needs to be a conversation with those stakeholders in order to navigate that. I think one problem with the biggest production, well, many problems with the biggest production systems, as we've seen, is that they tend to value one quantity over everything else, and that's yield. And so when you look at efficiency purely from a yield perspective, it externalizes all of the other impacts that you might have to water runoff, nutrient pollution, and so on. So that needs to be taken care of. Although I don't think that is impossible or that can't be done responsibly, particularly, again, if you're focused on feeding people and not sort of losing 90% of the energy, moving to the next trophic level. And then on the other side, right, and so that's a problem, but it's something that I think is surmountable. On the other side of things, right, when you start to talk about diversified smallholder agricultural systems, we talk about this land sharing idea and how agrobiodiversity or agroecology can foster biodiversity. I think one important thing to remember there is that we are also living in a biodiversity crisis, okay? One of the most stark that we can pinpoint in the history of extinction, right? And there are a lot of us on the planet. And so I also wear this other hat of a climate scientist and environmentalist alongside a food person, right? And while agrobiodiversity, I think, is incredibly attractive and incredibly powerful concept and should be deployed in some areas, you are still making a decision as a human about what that landscape is going to look like. And that is going to have an impact on what you see in the kinds of species that are there, right? And it is still going to be not an extractive process, but a process by which you are extracting something for human consumption, okay? And so you are still making a decision. And so if that decision is that all land is now going to be under biodiversity or human use, that can be a little problematic in and of itself, right? We need wild spaces, right? And by wild, this terminology is all, but we need spaces that are not necessarily set up for extraction, right, in that way. So, and you could argue, oh, well, you can return nutrients to the soil and it's not so extractive. And I think that's, everything is great in theory. It's sort of where the rubber hits the road in that kind of practice. So I don't know that and so maybe here's sort of where you're getting at and sort of I don't know that it serves us to villainize production systems on either end in and of themselves. I see merits across these production systems, and I think they should both be there, and that should be an open conversation. I think the more important question is not so much what system should we have everywhere, but it's more of who has agency and control over those systems, right? And what is the bottom line, or what is the goal of these systems? And I think it's that, right? And this opens up an assortment of other issues that directly intersect. We act like production is divorced from everything else, and it's not, right? It's land tenure, right? How long do you have access to these land resources? How far into the future are you able to think about your cropping system, about what you want that to look like? Or are you just living season to season, right? Another component of this is, right, who has access and ownership of the intellectual property that goes into agricultural systems. And this is not just the seed, but it's also the utilities, the implements, the machinery that goes into that. That's an important component of it as well, too. Laws, right? Everything from labor laws. I had a farmer once upstate New York tell me, and she was working on 14 acres of land and living season to season, and she wasn't certified organic, but she was sort of like, practicing organic. And so we talked about why she wasn't certified organic, and she said, Sonali, the one thing, she's like, if you want to talk about sustainability, the one thing I will tell you that limits our ability to be environmentally sustainable is labor. And she just called it, and she said, if I know I have the labor at the beginning of the season to harvest a diversified cropping system at the end of the season, then I will do a diversified cropping system, and that is much more sustainable in my view. I can do push-pull, I can do all sorts of things that limit the amount of input I need, and then I have the labor to harvest it. But I can't afford to hire that labor into perpetuity year-round and provide them the same kinds of benefits that a big ag system would. They deserve it, but I don't have that wherewithal. And so if I don't have that labor, then I'm gonna plant corn, and then I'm gonna fertilize it and I'm gonna do whatever. And that was really eye-opening, right? Because that's not just about what could happen nicely in principle, is what can happen according to the constraints that people face today. And so we have all of these big debates about what's possible from a consumption standpoint or a production standpoint, but to me, the biggest components of how the food system can or won't change is everything that happens in the middle, right? And where those leverage points are, and who holds authority and agency over those decisions, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to pick up on that point about authority and agency, and I think maybe this is often again oversimplified as a picture, but we kind of have this system in which there's a small handful of very large companies, not only on the seed front, but also meat production in the world is completely dominated by a handful of big companies. All the kind of processing that we experience, is that a big part of this picture where this kind of ownership is just so concentrated in a very specific type of corporate form and structure?
Right.
And is that sort of, obviously the practicalities of how you go about changing that, maybe we can't sort of speculate on, but in theory, is that really key to sort of unraveling this kind of thorny knot?
I think, is it key? Yeah, I'm a lowly climate scientist, so I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's key. In my opinion, it is a major component. If we can't, so what I will say is I don't know if it's key, but if we want to tackle the assortment of crises facing agriculture, from food security to climate change, in both ways, right? Then we have to be talking about multinationals. We have to be talking about the corporate structure and the setup of agribusiness and agricultural trade as it stands today. And so this is both the private players and insofar as our trade networks are built to facilitate, and you get these public-private intersection points that amplify the system. We have to be talking about that. One of the big problems that we've found in some of our work is that these multinationals, it's not very, the Paris Climate Agreement, in which countries, so the Paris Climate Agreement, these UN climate frameworks are very much focused on countries as your major actor, and that makes sense, right? We tend to break down contributions and the role of countries in these contributions because ostensibly they have capacity to regulate those emissions and to reform their industries internally to help do that. So that makes sense. However, there are different ways of conceptualizing responsibility. And it's not always clear to us that a lot of these big corporate agricultural or meat processing entities or players are necessarily beholden to any one country's, because they're operating across contexts, right? And they might be more influenced by one nation state or the other. But what if we also looked at responsibility, not from a nation state perspective or a sovereignty perspective, but also from the perspective of these corporate actors? What would that look like? How would you go about regulating that? At this point, I think some of the biggest ways that we have to really try to put a check on that are maybe through regulation, but through the courts, right? And some of these legal systems. But without having some sort of regulatory or other instruments to make these entities, these multinational corporate consolidated states, accountable to the climate crisis, accountable to the people, accountable to the ecosystems that they're extracting from. And that doesn't even necessarily mean, I'm not even that ambitious, I'm not even sure, that doesn't even necessarily mean shutting them down, right? It just means having a conversation, even just engaging in rigorous assessment of what their impact is. It's hard to even get them to do that. That I don't see how we will go about addressing the climate crisis or any other ecological crisis or even food security crisis necessarily without being able to have that conversation. And it is because so much of these supply chains, so much of the locus of environmental damage, you look at JBS in Brazil, for example, right? So much of the areas that are hotbeds of environmental impact, climate impact, and extraction for agriculture, right? So much of that is dictated by these large agribusiness, right, or food system supply chain actors and players. And so they have an important role to play in sort of bringing that back within the limits that they need to function within. So absolutely, I think that's a critical piece. For example, one thing that we're thinking a lot about right now is in the last few years, we've seen this spate of net zero carbon or net zero commitments from a lot of these multinationals. And when you start to look under the hood, it's unclear what they mean or if they know what they mean about what net zero actually is, when they'll achieve it, how they'll achieve it. All of the details on this are very thin. And there's no way to really, at scale, regulate them or hold them accountable for what that means. Some of that is inherent to the way that we think about emissions, like scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, so whether they're occurring at the site or totally within house of where these companies are located, or whether they're happening down the supply chain, for example. That nebulousness is not just the fault of the companies, it's a fault of the regulators and everyone else as well too. Buying offsets on land, for example, that might be a fault of the companies themselves or the regulatory markets in some cases so there are all these other elements, all these other parts of the economic system, particularly the one that's proliferating around climate now, that I think if you're not looking at the angle of multinationals or these corporate actors, then you're missing a big piece of the puzzle at this point. And at this point, I don't know that we're doing the best job of it. But I think there could be more to do. Yeah.
And I guess some of that must just come down to the fact that our food production systems are so invisible to the average person. I mean, you kind of walk into a shiny grocery store and there's a package of chicken breast that's just kind of there, and you sort of miss the entire supply chain that's involved in that, and the labor involved in that, and the kind of exploitation.
Sure.
I want to turn a little bit, just as a sort of final question, to, I guess, we've talked about different things that do need to change, or some solutions like a sort of agroecological approach that might be part of the answer, but if neither of those is perfectly satisfactory, we can't fully get rid of the sort of modern production systems that, as you point out, have been really important for feeding the world. Yeah. What does a sustainable food system look like? I mean, big question, but sort of key bullet points, and what are the factors that we need to most build it around? So thinking of the concept of food justice here, for example.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a small question.
Yeah. Solve all our problems.
Solve all of our problems. Well, look, I think a sustainable food system has to be oriented around feeding people. And that seems stupid simple, but that's not really what our current food system, for as productive as our food system is, I would not call feeding people the number one priority of it, which is unfortunate and a little bit sad given how much technology and investment and brilliance has sort of gone into it, right? The fact that it's not doing what everyone thinks it should be doing is a bit unfortunate. So I think, and this falls, I think, within the food justice space, but I think it's not even getting as deep as food justice. I think our food system has to be oriented towards getting at the 800 million people who go hungry every day. And those are just the worst classifications of hunger. There are even there's people in the United States, people on the street here in Manhattan, when you go down, that are periodically hungry, right? So we're good enough. We need to eliminate that. We need to move towards zero hunger somehow. And so a food system, and that doesn't just mean production, it means trade, it means rules of conflict even that still provide food going towards, places that need it. That needs to change, and we need to figure out what needs to be done both at the international governance level, the regional and nation-state governance level, and how that plays with the private enterprise system, right? All of that needs to come together to make sure that we eliminate hunger and that we're working towards that. At the same time, a sustainable food system, while we're targeting the hunger question, should also be looking to bring us back within, and not to necessarily lean on the planetary boundaries framework, but the safe operating space, right? We need to be using less water for agricultural irrigation, particularly in places where groundwater is running low. And that's in many of the highest production places. So how do we use water better, and to what ends become really important. We need to start using synthetic fertilizer to the extent that we want to use it still, but I think it's going away, it's important. But we need to start using that a bit more wisely. And again, to me, the question becomes not just incremental advances at more efficient systems, but to what end, right? What is the end goal, right? And if you restructure everything towards feeding people, I think all of these other parameters, whether we eat meat, what we grow, do we grow soy here, do we not, that actually starts to fall in line, right? And then there are questions about, like luxury crops and other things that, farmers do want to trade, and they do want to see people in other countries eating that because that's part of this ecosystem. We can talk about what that looks like a bit later. That's not the bulk of the production, right, that we're concerned about. So I think a sustainable food system has to foreground feeding the most people and doing it, and even that alone could actually even address some of the environmental problems, but I think it's important to explicitly integrate the fact that to do it with less water, and more water for the environment, and to do it with less nutrients, and ensuring that we don't have loss of those nutrients. And I think when you start to do that, you will start to see important changes in other dimensions of the problem. And that seems like it should be easy. And yet, a friend said once, and I can't remember who, the problem with agriculture as opposed to fossil fuels for climate, right? You don't see family coal mines as much, right? And I think that's a really important thing to point out. Food and agriculture, nobody cares when you flip your switch what is powering your light. You just want the light to go on. You don't really care about where. But we have all of this ingrained projection onto where our food comes from, the family farmer, right? Like these notions of tilling the land being synonymous with cultural heritage. That's what makes it so much more complex, right? And so it can be this very simple goal of feeding the world gets wrapped up in all sorts of other identities that we have with the way that we grow food. And that's, I think, what makes it, both very challenging, but I do think you can leverage that for, I do think that you can pull on those heartstrings a little bit towards this goal. And I think that can be a pretty good thing, but that's what makes agriculture much more complex. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much.